We'll be starting in a few minutes, so please can everyone keep your microphones on mute. Before we start, here's just a few reminders. So as you've probably heard, we're recording the presentation and the discussion for those who would like to reference the meeting later on. For your convenience, we'll share the slides we're sharing today by email after the presentation. And if you have any questions during the session, then please feel free to type them in the chat box. We've also got the proponents of the blueprints on the line, so they'll be able to answer questions throughout the presentation, or our analysts can as well. But we're also going to have a Q&A segment at the end, so you can talk then to the analytical team or the proponents. So yeah, if you can keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation, and then during the Q&A, when you want to ask a question, just use the raise hand function, and I'll call out those who would like to speak. So just wait 1 or 2 minutes in case there's anyone else wanting to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I think we'll kick this off. Hi everyone, so I'm Anna Baum from Climate Policy Initiative. I'm the Programme Manager for the GNIplus programme in Kenya, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our webinar today on blueprints for climate finance in Kenya. As you can see from the agenda on your screen, we have an hour and it's a pretty packed schedule, so I'm going to dive straight in. By way of background, CPI is an analysis and advisory organisation with deep expertise in finance and policy. Our mission at CPI is to help governments, businesses and financial institutions to drive economic growth whilst addressing climate change at the same time. CPI has 6 different offices around the world in Brazil, India, Indonesia, Kenya, the UK and the US. CPI is the lead partner on the GNIplus programme. So that stands for the Global NDC Implementation Partners. It's a collaboration between 4 organisations that you can see at the bottom of the screen: Pollination, ACOM, Ricardo and CPI. These organisations came together after the Paris Agreement was signed, where it was identified that there's a need for more technical support to implement NDCs globally. The main focus as a consortium has been mobilising private investment needed and creating long-term sustainable growth for partner countries. The GNIplus Kenya project is a 4-year programme funded by the German government, and it will be finishing shortly. So one of the aspects that CPI has undertaken under GNIplus is the Kenya landscape of climate finance. So this is the main output of the landscape, and it's a Sankey diagram showing the path of climate finance along its life cycle. So we have the sources on your left-hand side, through the instruments that we use, all the way to the climate priorities in the National Climate Change Action Plan in Kenya, and the sectors that were financed. So in total, you can see 243.3 billion Kenyan shillings of public and private capital invested in climate activities in 2018. Mitigation measures accounted for the lion's share of this investment, so that's almost 80% of the total. And actually only 11.7% was directed to adaptation activities. Now, if we compare this to the recently updated NDC, where Kenya's raised its ambition and also the amount of investment that's actually needed, we can see that it's about a third of what would be needed to meet the updated NDC's climate financing needs. So if we now compare that to the estimated finance needed for each of the sectors in the NDC, you can see that we're falling short in quite a few of the sectors. In particular, the forestry, wildlife and tourism sector, as well as the water and blue economy sectors. So this is why we're here today, and the blueprints presented today offer solutions to tackle the sectoral investment gaps reflected in this graph in front of you. And they're currently being designed and some of them piloted in Kenya. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Elvis, who will start running you through the blueprints for climate finance in Kenya.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. I'm Elvis Wakaba. I'm an analyst with the Climate Policy Initiative. So our analysis showed the underserved sectors that Anna just mentioned previously do not easily attract investment because of lack of knowledge around adaptation activities, a lack of access to information, a lack of capacity to implement, and high setup cost. Therefore, there is a need for innovative financial instruments that address these barriers in these crucial sectors. My colleague, Ricardo, and I will take you through 3 innovative market-based approaches that do just that. Specifically, I'll be presenting the Africa Conservancy Fund and then hand it over to my colleague, Ricardo, to present Chulu Hills PES and the Green Village Savings and Loan Association Scheme, all of which have the potential to support economic benefits while improving nature conservation. The Africa Conservancy Fund. So let's begin with some background. Kenya has lost nearly 70% of its wildlife in the last 30 years due to loss of space and connectivity associated with increasing development pressures. 65% of the remaining wildlife in Kenya lives within territories managed by wildlife conservancies. For those who may not know, conservancies are community or privately owned lands set aside to provide safeguards and benefits to wildlife and the landowners. They play a key role in preventing deforestation and land conversion while securing better livelihoods for local communities. Conservancies work as follows. Landowners lease out their land to the conservancies and in return earn lease fees from land that would alternatively be used for agricultural purposes or would have been sold. These conservancies then have the responsibility to protect and conserve the wildlife they have within their borders. These conservancies generally fund their conservation efforts through a license fee to an associated tourism partner. The tourism partner invests in hospitality infrastructure and related ecotourism services. Therefore, in essence, tourism funds the Conservancy's activities. Although this conservation model has proven useful to wildlife and communities, it faces threats. To be precise, the reduction of tourism revenue, lack of income diversification from resilient sources, and poor governance threatens this conservancy model that is popular in Africa. Without proceeds from ecotourism, conservancies can neither afford fees paid to landowners or their conservation efforts. The ACF presents an innovative solution to this problem. As a blended finance fund of funds, ACF will invest in regional investment vehicles that provide revenue-based loans to conservancies to meet their lease payments to landowners, improve their governance, and diversify revenue. We discuss this further in the slides that follow. There are 2 potential impacts of the ACF. Firstly, the ACF loan product will help avoid emissions that would occur from conservancy land being converted to other land users. For example, the Mara Relief Fund can potentially increase the resilience of 1,400 kilometers squared of conservancies across the Mara from the threat of land conversion. Secondly, enhance resilience of conservancies through improved governance models, expanding or modernizing conservancy infrastructure, and exploring revenue mechanisms such as carbon credits and sustainable livestock diversification opportunities. There are 3 key takeaways from our analysis of these instruments. First, conservancies are established in a way in which they overly rely on grant revenues or tourism partner license fees. 2, there is a need for conservancies to diversify their revenues and improve their economic sustainability. 3, given the number of conservancies across Africa and the similarity of their business models, the opportunities for the Africa Conservancy Fund are vast. Okay, now let's see how this instrument works in more detail in the next slide. This is a diagram of the instrument mechanics. The green box represents the blended capital that would be provided to the African Conservancy Fund by private investors, philanthropies, and DFIs. This funding will comprise grants, concessional loans, and equity investment. The ACF will be managed by Conservation International. The ACF, which is in orange, on lends to the regional conservancy relief funds, also in orange. These regional conservancy relief funds then provide the revenue-based loans to conservancies in their respective regions. These revenue-based loans are what make the ACF innovative, since they allow for repayments to occur after tourism levels have returned to normalcy and an agreed occupancy level is reached. Once this is achieved, the tourism partners begin to repay the loan. The loans also have governance strengthening and revenue diversification conditions. The regional conservancies will also support the conservancies with technical assistance to ensure loan terms are met, as well as identify ways for conservancies to diversify their income through efforts such as development of carbon projects and diversified livestock revenue streams, ongoing over the life of the transaction and intended to continue long beyond the term of the loan. Now let's look at the relationship between the conservancies in peach and the tourism partners, landowners, landscape, and resilient fund all in purple. So as we had discussed, conservancies provide tourism partners with the right to operate in their areas. The tourism partners then provide fees back to the conservancies with those fees. The conservancy is able to meet its lease obligations to the landowners, who in turn lease their land to the conservancies. Regarding the landscape, the Conservancy can develop revenue diversification activities, such as participation in carbon credit schemes and sustainable livestock diversification opportunities. These different income streams will bring further returns to the conservancies. From these returns, the conservancies can contribute to a resilience fund, which will provide financial resilience back to the conservancy. Finally, the profits that will follow after the conservancy has met its cost will be used to repay regional conservancy relief funds, which will then pay back to the ACF, which will then pay back to the investors. In the next slide, we found that while analyzing this mechanism, there are some opportunities as well as challenges. We found that the instrument is highly replicable, given the number of conservancies in Africa and the similarity of their business models, and that organizations such as Conservation International and other NGOs are on hand to support conservancies to explore ways to diversify their revenue streams. In terms of challenges, conservancies face limited sources of finance due to single revenue streams, often lack capacity to enact change, and lack of repayment history and a track record may deter funders. I'll pass you over now to my colleague, Ricardo.
Thank you, Elvis, for the presentation. And I just want to remind everybody that if you had any questions about what Elvis just presented, pop it into the chat box, and we can discuss it in the Q&A session at the end. So moving on to the second blueprint that we analyzed, the Tula Hills payment for ecosystem services. Let's first start with some context. In the last 40 years, Africa has lost the highest percentage of tropical forests globally. And Kenya itself has lost over between 80 or 90% of the tree cover because of the severe pressure from human activities. Currently, Kenya's forest cover is estimated at only 7.4% of the total land area, which is well below the constitutionally mandated goal of achieving and maintaining 10% forest cover by this year, 2022. To achieve this goal, Kenya needs to plant an estimated 2.5 million hectares. And public resources, including those provided from international development partners, are far from being enough to close this gap, this investment gap. The only remedy to both Kenya and Africa's forest crisis is to conserve existing forest areas and develop successful financial solutions to mobilize private capital to conserve and plant trees. Move on to the next slide, please. This is why the Tula Hills Payment for Ecosystems Services project was conceived. Led by the Tula Hills Conservation Trust, they found that over-reliance on philanthropic and public funding, which is uncertain and variable, threatened their efforts to conserve and maintain the Tula Hills watershed, which provides so many value to surrounding communities, including water users in Mombasa. They needed to diversify their income. Their idea was to design a payment for ecosystem services at the Tula Hills. PES schemes are defined as voluntary transactions where a land or resource manager, a seller, provides a well-defined ecosystem service, such as climate regulation, water quality regulation, or habitat for wildlife, to an ecosystem service beneficiary, i.e. a buyer, who pays periodically for the service because they are being supplied something superior to what would otherwise be provided in the absence of that payment. The services most often secured through PES schemes include carbon storage and sequestration, biodiversity, and water supply and water quality management. The Tula Hills Conservation Trust recognized that the implementation of this PES scheme would halt deforestation and conserve the ecosystem, which provides services which are valued at $260 million. The key takeaway in the design of the Tula Hills PES is that although the ecosystem provides an enormous amount of value, there's a lack of understanding by the stakeholders involved of the benefits of preserving the services which it provides and the associated costs that they would see if the ecosystem fails, which will be significant negative impact to Mombasa and the surrounding communities. Therefore, a phased implementation plan where the evidence base can be developed and also provides the necessary allowance of time for the beneficiaries to understand its benefits and shift the current payment paradigm is critical. To explain this a little bit better, I'm going to go through the design of the PES in this slide. Yeah, thank you. I first want to direct your eyes to the orange box. The Tula Hills area is currently protected by the Tula Hills Conservation Trust, whose funding currently stems from philanthropic sources and the Red Plus program, which you can see on the top two green boxes on the left. However, these funding sources are variable and uncertain, and it is projected that in order to fully protect the forest of the Tula Hills, an extra $6.3 to $11.8 million annually is needed. It is from this vantage point that the Tula Hills Conservation Trust embarked on the design of the Tula Hills Payment for Ecosystem Services, which you can see is the third green box down on the left. I would explain this side of it and the proposed design of the downstream water user payment implementation scheme last, because I first want to take you through the logic in the purple boxes on the right of the Tula Hills Conservation Trust. With the funding received, the trust invests in protection and improvements of the watershed. These investments improve the ecosystem and thus improve the carbon ecosystem services and the non-carbon ecosystem services. The carbon ecosystem services are more straightforward to grasp. Basically, as trees grow, they capture carbon, and the carbon credits produced can be sold in the voluntary carbon market. The Tula Hills currently does this through the Red Plus program. However, as mentioned previously, the funding coming from this source still falls short from halting its deforestation. The watershed also produces many non-carbon ecosystem services that include improved water supply, tourism and biodiversity, and hazard management. If the ecosystem fails, it will affect all its beneficiaries, including Kenyan citizens and wildlife in general, but perhaps more immediately, large industrial users and domestic consumers of water. Okay, now let's go back to the proposed design of the downstream water user payment implementation scheme that zooms out of the Tula Hills PES box on the left. In designing the pricing system, the project proponents knew that adding a new price per cubic meter of water would be a paradigm shift for users. In addition to this, they know that a pipeline extension plan is to be completed by 2030, which will bring a greater amount of water to the city of Mombasa, meaning that there will be a reduced price per cubic meter of water needed to be raised through because of economies of scale. These two main factors led them to decide on a phased implementation approach. In phase one, in the first 5 years, there will be a voluntary fixed fee to be paid by donors, philanthropies, and other large water users. This amount of the fee will depend on a per hectare quantity that they choose to protect. This period will allow the PES organizers to start educating users and the public in general on the importance of pricing ecosystem services and their role in providing water supplies. In phase two, the next 4 years, we'll see a phase-in of unit pricing for water users on a year-on-year basis by decreasing the proportion of the funding gap paid by the flat fee payers and increasing the proportion allocated to the unit payers. You can grasp this concept visually in the phase two box by seeing how the black bar of the voluntary payers is decreased year on year and how the gray bar of the domestic consumers is increased. Phase three, after 2030, all financing will come from water users. This phase is introduced at the same time as the additional provision of water to Mombasa through the second pipeline to take advantage of the economies of scale that will allow for a lower fee per unit of water to the domestic consumers, which will result in only a slight increase in the current water price. Effectively, it will only be a 10-cent increase on a cubic meter of water at that point. Next slide, please. So in the process of working with the proponents, it led our team to identify the following opportunities and challenges. In terms of opportunity, PES schemes are designed to be financially sustainable and therefore offers an opportunity to move away from typical funding arranged by governments and NGOs for ecosystems. Also, the PES schemes are also highly replicable and have been implemented globally. Third, a market-based solution provides managers a better grasp of the amount of budget they will have at their disposal, rather than a system of uncertain voluntary donations. And the last opportunity, best PES schemes can be designed to improve livelihoods and reduce poverty amongst rural communities who live within such ecosystems. As for challenges, PES schemes pose the following issues. They have high setup costs. They have unanticipated impacts that can arise that affect the provision of the service. There's long-term sustainability is difficult to achieve because, which is mainly due to a need for effective monitoring and enforcement, which is critical yet often lacking. And with that, we're done with the second blueprint. I've seen that there's been a lot of activity in the chat box, which I'm looking forward to look at. But thank you very much. We're gonna move straight on to a third showcase blueprint, the Green Village Savings and Loan Association. Let's start with a bit of context. Kenya is dependent on many climate sensitive sectors, such as some of the ones that Anna described, making adaptation to climate change vital for its economic resilience. Therefore, Kenya has an adaptation-focused NDC with ambitious targets for water and the blue economy. Many of the climate interventions needed to build resilience in these sectors are implemented at the community scale. Improving credit access is an important component to increasing resilience of small-scale producers, because access to capital is a key driver of the community's ability to implement adaptation strategies. Thank you. However, it is difficult to mobilize funding for adaptation and conservation activities in communities that lack access to formal financial services. A solution is to adapt the common village savings and loans association concept that addresses lack of access to credit in low-income communities by adding a feature that makes environmental conservation efforts by each borrower a prerequisite. Effectively, the Green Village Savings and Loan Association concept will incentivize local communities to implement ecological actions by attaching environmental conservation efforts to microgroup loans. This has the potential impact to increase financial, social, and natural capital of the local populations. Through this mechanism, communities will be incentivized to restore, protect, and sustainably utilize multiple ecosystems. This will lead to recovered ecosystem productivity, supporting livelihoods, and also biodiversity. A key takeaway is that the Green Village Savings and Loan Association promotes financial inclusion with an added benefit of having the local communities directly engaged in the environmental projects that they select and how they are implemented. It has the potential to mobilize resources not yet tapped to combat climate change. And I'm going to expand on this concept in the next 2 slides. Thank you. So traditionally, the initial capital for a community lending scheme, such as a village savings and loans association, would be a development grant provided by NGO or let's say a donor. However, in the Green Village Savings and Loans Association concept, a local business provides the groups with the grant, as you can see in the figure. It is worth taking a moment to justify the reasoning why a business would have the incentive to do this, because it's a central feature of this idea. If we take the service sector as an example, the local business could be perhaps a hotel, a restaurant, a tourist services company, or any other local business that benefits from an improved natural landscape in the community in which it operates. Imagine in this hypothetical example that coastal fishing communities are overfishing the local reefs to earn a daily income. This in turn can result in the reduction of the reef's attractiveness for tourists, which in turn impacts hotels. Therefore, a hotel can benefit from implementations such as the introduction of no fishing days on the local reef and or community patrols to ensure compliance, which could bring back fish and prevent coral damage. This can be made possible if the business, a hotel for example, provides a grant to activate the Green Village and Savings Association. Therefore, grants are received by each group. These groups then distribute the money among their members as microloans tied to implementation of environmental objectives. In this example, the loans would be tied to better fishing management practices, such as those I previously described. In addition, the funding from the loans can allow fishermen to acquire equipment that facilitate further offshore fishing so that the reefs are better protected for tourism. These environmental implementations positively affect the local landscape or ecosystem, which results in an increased bottom line for the local business. It's also worth explaining the purple group box in more detail too. The groups would operate in the same way that current village savings and loans associations do. There's nothing new. In short, once the groups are organized, they receive the money, and then each member of the group, when needed, gains access to a microloan. These members pay back the loan with interest, which then further increases the pot that can subsequently be lent out. In this way, each group's amount of money that it operates continues to grow for subsequent use. In essence, village and saving and loans associations are designed to support those whose income is irregular and unreliable or do not have access to formal financial services. The basic principle of these associations is that the funding is provided to communities which then self-manage the funds. These self-managed groups lend this money to one another on appropriate terms. The management of the pot of money will be no different in this concept. Next slide, please. But now, let me take you through the full implementation of the design concept. Okay, first off, investors can provide debt or equity to the fund. The fund then lends to local businesses who benefit from the conservation or improved management of natural resources as the example I explained in the previous slide. The local business then distributes the loan received to relevant community groups as a grant, which is channeled through a local environmental project developer. The local business will rely on the project developer to work with the groups and organize the specific activities that are to take place. But local businesses obviously can also participate directly by communicating the environmental activities that they expect the groups to undertake. The implementing NGO helps the group members monitor financial and environmental progress using the GNIPlus mobile application, which you can see in the peach colored box in the middle there. GNIPlus provides environmental project developers and impact investors with digital tools for project design, management, and impact monitoring and accounting. These tools speed up and reduce the cost of implementing projects for ecosystem restoration and protection. As mentioned in the previous slide, the local business benefit is that the improved landscape enhances its financial performance. Improved financial performance will facilitate repayment of the loans that were received by the GVSLA fund. In essence, the GVLSA is an SME loan fund with the added benefit of direct multi-staker local community involvement, as well as the ability to directly measure ecological impact resulting from the loans. It is envisioned that impact investors will have an appetite to be involved in earlier stages, with private investors participating once there is proof of concept and returns are more transparent. Thank you. The process of working with these proponents led our team to identify the following opportunities and challenges. For opportunities, we found that through this mechanism, funding will be given directly to small-scale adaptation action at the local level and empower communities to implement adaptation actions required to build resilience. Next, this model can be very versatile and fit into multiple landscapes, which allows for not only scalability, but also replication in other areas or countries with similar challenges. In addition, the financial inclusion and the data generated from the instrument can provide further transparency to the model, incentivize or provide local lenders the information required to participate. Last, for the opportunities, this design engages the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change, which is very important, and provides them with the tools and financing appropriate to their needs. In terms of challenges, this model can be perceived as too complex by the local businesses. Its environmental benefits might not produce immediate results. And last, unpredictable returns until the model is properly, there will be unpredictable returns until the model is properly implemented. Yeah, and again, I saw a lot of activity in the chat box, which is good. I'll just take a minute to say thank you, and I'll hand it to Elvis to close out the blueprint section of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. All these innovative blueprints for climate finance have common themes. Three themes in particular. One, these blueprints use innovative approaches to mobilize private funding sources to ensure more self-sustaining business models that support key sectors of the economy. These three instruments show that while there are significant opportunities to mobilize private sector investment, concessional finance is a key ingredient to develop these models at the earliest stages. Three, these instruments consider phased development that helps prove the concept in earlier stages before pursuing additional rounds of capital raising. I'll now hand over to my colleague Anna for the Q&A section.
Thanks, Ricardo and Elvis, for running us through those three blueprints. That was really interesting and helpful. And also thanks everyone for being super active in the chat box. I'm now confident that there'll be lots to talk about in this Q&A session. And as some of you might have noticed, we have some of the blueprint partners on the line here who will answer some of the questions related to the instruments and have also been answering some questions in the chat function. So actually, can anyone put up their hand? I'll use the raise hand function if you've got a question that you want to ask. And thanks, Caroline, for sharing the final report. So the Blueprints for Climate Finance report has been published today, and you can find it in the link she's provided in the chat. But we'll also send the slides around after, so everyone has that information. So yeah, do raise your hand if you want to ask any questions. And whilst we're waiting for that, I'll just address one of the quite common questions in the chat box. So related to the Tula Hills PES, quite a few people are asking about the willingness to pay from the Mombasa water users, which, you know, is a really key question. And I think probably the biggest challenge when you start to set up a PES is thinking about who the buyers would be and their willingness to pay, especially for something which up until now, they've effectively had free of charge. So this is something that definitely takes time to address, hence why we brought that phased approach into the model. But there definitely would be a willingness in the longer term, which has already been shown by the setup of the Nairobi water PES, which the Nature Conservancy set up, I think about 5 years ago. And the Nature Conservancy is actually in the process of establishing, so it's called the Nairobi Water Fund, and the Nature Conservancy are in the process of establishing a Mombasa Water Fund and an Eldoret Water Fund. And the Tula Hills PES will be built into and is being currently built into the business case for the Mombasa Water Fund. So water users will pay into the Mombasa Water Fund, and a portion of that fee will go towards the Tula Hills PES. And that would be relative to the water supply from the pipeline from the Mazimba Springs at Tula Hills. So, and I see in the chat, there's also a question on the Green Village Saving and Loan Association project that, Mark, perhaps you can address from Helen. How does membership work and how is the share of proceeds done?
So it's a template model, and the way it works is that we as GreenFi provide a model or rails for local project developers to pull off the shelf and use as they see fit. And with the benefit of an implementation which is taking place in Nyandarua and is currently underway on the Kenyan South Coast, we see that local project developers adapt the system quite substantially to fit the local context and also fit the sort of the local natural resource management challenges. And so there's the sort of the answer to your question is that there's sort of no one size fits all. The membership will be set, by the group according to the resource that is being managed and the sort of local institutional context in which they sit. So for some examples, sometimes the membership is set according to sort of participation in local farmers groups, or membership of a local natural resource management group, like a sort of beach management unit, or potentially community forest associations or water resource users associations in the Kenyan context specifically. But we really want local project developers to pick up the tools and adapt them according to their own use. So that was the answer to the question about membership there.
Thanks very much, Mark. And Rose, hi Rose, from KFS. I see you also have a question.
Hi everyone, and mine is not a question, but just a comment about the webinar and the presentations, the 3 case studies that have been presented, and just to inform colleagues that we are in the process of doing the Forest and Landscape Implementation Action Plan for Kenya for the next 5 years to restore 2.5 million hectares. And there are a number of activities that we have proposed in it. But I think the presentation we are having today is an eye-opener, because what we have been struggling about is how these restoration efforts that we are proposing is going to make economic sense to the communities and stakeholders that are dependent on these resources. And so I just want to congratulate the team that has been able to develop these pilot projects that they are really, really key to the implementation of the bond challenge commitment and our national aspiration to achieve 10% recover. But all in all, as that we come up with business models that are going to make economic sense, because as mentioned earlier, this is one of the sectors that are underfunded, but also that there's a lot of dynamics in implementation of these nature-based solutions. So I'm really excited about the presentation, and we'll be looking forward to the contribution on this group on how to make a business case on some of the proposed restoration activities in different landscape in the country, because the Forest and Landscape Implementation Action Plan basically look at all the 4 landscape in the country, which has also been identified here in terms of the forest landscape, where we have the Tula Hills landscape. We also have the rangelands and the dryland ecosystem, where we have a lot of opportunities. But also we are also looking at the agricultural ecosystem, especially croplands, whereby the productivity is low, and the restoration and tree-based activities make more economic sense compared to continuing the cropping system. So I just want to congratulate the team that has put this together, and that we are looking forward to scale some of these innovative practices across the entire country. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rose. That's really appreciated, and it sounds like pertinent timing. And I think one of the important things to highlight in light of the work you're doing and about to do is the replicability of these instruments. So the point and the reason we're calling them blueprints is, whilst they're active examples and in most cases being piloted, they're also replicable both in Kenya and outside. So it's important to take the lessons from these projects and think about how we can use them elsewhere, because as you mentioned and we mentioned before, it's one of the sectors that it is hard to attract private investment into. So we have to be particularly innovative and use these sort of tried and tested approaches. And I think the challenge is particularly highlighted with how everyone's picking out the sort of the difficult questions of, you know, how do we encourage people to pay for these services that at the moment are being provided for free? You know, how do we add a value? And on the PES for the Tula Hills and the value of those services, another really interesting piece of work from GNIplus partners at ACOM is this natural capital accounting system. So I have a link to it here on the last slide that you'll be able to get after the presentation. And we have here the digital natural capital account for the Tula Hills, which goes through all the environmental services provided by the forest and shows the value of those different services in detail, and the value they're providing to others outside of the Tula Hills. And this is to help build that business case, to help other people understand the value that is being provided and that needs to be protected, and to understand why, for example, they would pay into a payment for ecosystem services scheme. So I don't know if anyone has any other questions, then do feel free to raise your hand, or anything relevant that you'd like to share with the group on the call today. And in the meantime, there was another question from Wangi in the chat, directed towards the Green Village Saving and Loan Association. So just asking, as it wasn't clear from the presentation, what the actual original source of the money is, and the primary motivation of the 3 financiers in the green boxes. So just to understand the relationship between the role of the investors, the Green Village Saving Loan Association Fund and local businesses. So Mark, perhaps you can share something and I'll put us on this slide, which might help.
So the source of grants within this model, where we're trying to mobilize private capital to the model rather than philanthropic or donor grants, is from local businesses who are dependent on local ecosystem service provision and partnership with local communities to improve the provision of those services. And really, this was sort of pushing the model to try and bring more capital to the table. I think that addresses the question.
Great, thanks, Mark. Hopefully that addresses your question. And I've just seen another one from Rose. How do you intend to manage community expectations in all of the 3 projects? So I think that's another really key question, and one I've seen particularly in the Tudor Hills context. What was actually interesting, if we look at the history of the Tudor Hills and the setup of the REDplus project, which is effectively a carbon PES, we've seen actually at the start there was really low expectations, and it's only over time, and once the REDplus program has started to really deliver, that we've seen more and more engagement, and people realize, oh, this actually can really work. And now the REDplus project in Tudor Hills is really successful. And so I think in that case, actually, the community expectations from the start was quite low and have built over time as they've seen the success of the program. So I think that's also the importance of the phased approaches that we're recommending, is to not only prove the model for those to pay, but also to bring the community along with us in the rollout of these schemes. So I don't know if Mark or Rob, there's anything you want to add specifically on your projects related to the community expectations?
Yeah, implementation is based on quite a long process of stakeholder and community consultation, with sort of a key objective being to sort of manage expectations, and grant disbursement being subject to sort of meeting of certain sort of milestones or milestone requirements, but it's with a sort of a specific view to managing those expectations, and also sort of putting in place funds before project implementation begins. So to go through sort of a period of sort of project design, designed to sort of have some drawdowns of commitments from lenders, also funders, before those initial sort of consultations take place, so that there isn't a sort of a withdrawal or a sort of sudden stepping back if money doesn't become available. Really, there needs to be sort of commitments in advance of detailed design and expectation raising with communities.
Very similar for the African Conservancies Fund as well. It's I mean, I'm not going to go into details, but echoing the same concepts that Mark's just articulated. It's all about detailed stakeholder consultation up front, and making sure that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities, and then exactly in a very similar way to what Mark described, sequencing loan dispersals in line with meetings of covenants and targets that have been set. Community expectations will always be difficult to manage, but I think it's a lot of stakeholders on the ground and partners that help with this sort of thing. It can't all be done from the top. You can't ultimately design this into a structure. It's got to be done with people on the ground, and working slowly together. So there's no magic to it. but I think all of the partners in the room, all of the NGOs that we've got dotted around the various landscapes know this space well and know how to work slowly and together with the communities. Back to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Mark and Rob. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think a good point also about the importance of not then withdrawing that support once you've added the value to the ecosystem service. So I see, Mandar, you've got a question about the data needed to make the models work and how big data tools can help reduce monitoring costs while building transparency. And this feels like maybe a question for Ricardo. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, yeah. I actually, I can answer very briefly, and then hand it to Mark since he leads GNIPlus, which is specialized at data and connecting the various stakeholders. But yeah, so and please correct me if I'm wrong, Rob and Mark, on your particular instruments. For the ACF, the data that is more required, I would feel, that is the amount of clients that are reaching the tourism partners, because the whole revenue-based loan is based on the amount of people going into the hotels, let's say. So I think that's the key data point for the ACF. For the Tula Hills, I think this is the most challenging one, and it has to do with what is the benefit that the water users are actually getting from the Tula Hills ecosystem. And that's very hard to quantify, and that is why the Tula Hills Conservation Trust, and now with TNC, that's why they came up with the idea of having this phase one, where the payment does not have to rely on a measurable data point, but rather just a fixed fee, because it's going to take a long time to develop those metrics. And also the measurement of those metrics. So it could be the amount of sedimentation in the water, for example. And then lastly, for the Green Savings and Loans Association, the data points would depend on the exact local community where that's being operated. And I'm going to hand it to you, Mark, for this one, because it's a bit complex with the different, let's say, regions. But for example, in the example that I did in the presentation, it would have to do with the amount of fish in the reef, the amount of reef that is not bleaching, let's say, and that sort of thing. But yeah, that was a very general answer, and I would hand it to Mark first, I guess. That leads the GNIPlus tool, and then maybe Rob, if you have something to add on the ACF.
What are the big data approaches that could be deployed here? So, at its heart, this is a performance-based system, and so monitoring needs to take place against performance rather than statistical probability of performance, because performance rates are affected by whether or not people believe that they're having to sort of offer verification of what they've achieved. So at the sort of the activity level, it's sort of maybe sort of not initially clear to me that there's an immediate role for big data approaches, but where there is then looking at the sort of the aggregated impact of individual actions that sort of coalesce to sort of create a sort of an ecosystem or landscape level impact, and that's where sort of big data is is appropriate. And we collect data that would be relevant to some of the statistical analyses that big data might sort of seek to employ, and present those in a user interface through the sort of the tools that we've developed. So I hope that answers it. It's probably not our sort of particular area of expertise, and we take sort of a relatively sort of simple and straightforward approach to that. But it's, I think, something that we're always sort of willing to partner on, to sort of learn more and improve the sort of the systems that are being offered to local project developers who take our sort of tools off the shelves.
And then for African Conservancies Fund, it's because it's still small. We haven't thought about exactly where big data would plug into this in any great detail. So I'm not going to try and synthesize an answer other than to say that at this stage, the repayment of the loans is dependent on ecotourism volumes, as was explained. And so ultimately, as I suppose the program grows, any big data sources that can help predict tourism volumes into Kenya or any of the landscapes that we look to scale into would absolutely help manage and monitor that the performance of those loans and predict their outcomes, at least from a loan performance point of view. As regards to compliance with conservation covenants, there could easily be incorporating satellite data into to the extent that there's conservation agreements around land protection and biodiversity protection as well. Satellite data monitoring and providing feedback on that would be able to help us measure the impact of the investments in those conservancies. So there's certainly scope in the future, but we have not built that into the thinking at this stage.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for the active Q&A session. It's always helpful to dig into a bit more detail. So just before we finish, I just wanted to talk a bit about considerations for accessing climate finance, as it was a key part of all of these different blueprints. So beyond the specific financial structures, there's some general considerations that proponents and implementing partners, either setting up a project or thinking of setting up a project, need to address during the capital raising stage. So to attract climate finance, we recommend putting together something like a climate positioning paper, or making it really clear how you address these three areas in the setup of your project. So the climate risks and challenges in the region, how your project's addressing those risks through either mitigation or adaptation, and then also how you're measuring. So in addition to articulating the project's climate relevance, there's also some other areas in the setup of a project that helps attract climate finance. And so here we're specifically talking about transparency. So this includes your organization's governance, having clear and attributable accounting, your theory of change, defining relevant metrics, key performance indicators, aligning with your funders' focus, and also looking at the co-benefits like the Sustainable Development Goals. So we also have some links which relate to all of the things we've talked about here today for those who've joined to access after this webinar. So firstly is the actual full blueprints report for climate finance in Kenya, where you'll see all of the detail behind the three projects that we've talked about today. And that's available on this link here at the top. But then we also have some supplementary information specific to each of the blueprints. So, and we also have the landscape of climate finance about the climate finance flows in Kenya. So we have something on the payment for ecosystem services. So there's an actual full toolkit for anyone looking to develop any PES in any location, but it uses the Tula Hills and Mount Elgon as two examples. And on that PES toolkit, we also have the financial model available that we've used in this process that others can download and adapt to their own payment for ecosystem services. We have specific information on the next point about the Tula Hills and the digital natural capital accounts. This is a really interesting and innovative website, so I encourage everyone to visit that. And then if you want more information about the African Conservancies Fund, then you can contact Rob Grave, who's been answering the questions related to that project. Or if you want to hear more about the Green Village Savings and Loans Association, then please do visit the GreenFi website or reach out to Mark on this call. So thanks everyone for joining. This has been a really helpful discussion. We'll circulate the slides after the presentation, and I urge you to visit also the website to look at the full report. And have a great afternoon, morning or evening, everyone. Thank you very much.